Morning. Hope this is recording. I'm out for a walk with Phoebes again. Beautiful day here in Cornwall. Look at that. Fantastic. But I noticed John Berger's died. John Berger, the author and cultural critic, died yesterday. It's funny to think if he died about 3 days earlier, he would have been added to the list of celebrities that had died in 2016. You know, he would have been part of that kind of annual narrative of horror that 2016 seems to have represented. Because he died a couple of cycles later, he wasn't added to that list. He's either become the first of a different list, or else, I don't know, it just feels different somehow, you know what I mean? Just the turning of the year has changed the meaning of his death somehow. It's not getting the same kind of attention. Getting attention, it just doesn't feel quite the same somehow. But I'm sure most of you know John Berger, but he's quite well known. And I met him some years ago, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But he's probably best known for a TV series he did in the early 70s called Ways of Seeing. That was eventually turned into a book of that name, about art and the changing meanings of art, particularly in 20th century, after the means of reproduction have been advanced. Kind of writing post Walter Benjamin, you know, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So a lot of what he talks about is about how art changed when it became kind of dislocated. You know, at one time he says if you wanted to see a work of art, you had to go to the place where it was. In a sense, all art was site specific at one point. It was painted for a specific location. He's talking particularly about paintings. It was, you know, particularly for a church or some grand building somewhere, and you had to go to that place to have the experience, he says, and the environment in which it was part of kind of helped provide the context for it and steered your interpretation of it and your understanding of it. But now he says, since art is not primarily viewed in its authentic state, it's usually viewed through postcards or images on the internet or on televisions and that kind of thing, in magazines, then it doesn't have that located aspect anymore. It's fragmented, and the context is something that's stripped away from it, its original context at least. And you have to know quite a lot about it. You have to do quite a lot of research perhaps to try to recover some of that original context. And the only context it has is the one that you bring to it. And with that context, of course, comes the ability to make your own interpretations, which could be a bad thing, but he doesn't seem to be saying it's entirely a bad thing. He seems to be saying it's a good thing, that art should connect to people and attempt to strip away context and just talk about kind of abstract aesthetics or something like that, or just the composition of an artwork in broad terms or in mystical terms, he says at one point, is perhaps a misunderstanding of the nature of art, and that we should, you know, carry our interpretation. If you know, given that we are in a situation in which it is stripped of its original context, then we shouldn't neglect the context that we ourselves provide and the interpretation that those contexts steer us towards. He's also talking about things like juxtaposition, the fact that now we see art juxtaposed with other kinds of images, other kinds of words and sounds and different musical accompaniments, and that changes our understanding of it. And again, that's something which we need to be aware of and perhaps use to our enjoyment and our edification in different ways, but definitely be aware of, and particularly when it's being used by people to steer our interpretations, recognise how our interpretations are being steered by the use of images and the use of sounds and words and so on, to produce meanings which you know, either weren't there as intended, or even if they were there as intended, aren't necessarily the ones that we would want to have at our disposal. It's a fascinating set of documentaries if you get the chance. It's all on YouTube and it's on UbuWeb as well, and they're really fantastic. They have dated a little bit because it's from the early 70s, but some of that dating I think is really interesting as well in some ways, because you know, things have moved on since then. At one point in the first episode, which I just watched this morning, he makes overt reference to Walter Benjamin, who I mentioned a minute ago, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. But he's talking about how, for example, he's talking about how if you're watching this show that he's doing, right, and showing these images, he says you might have come over and seen these images from watching one of the 2 other channels, he says, because there's only 3 channels in the UK, 3 television channels in the UK at that time, because of course it was before Sky and before Freeview and all the other channels came online. And now, of course, you might be coming at from hundreds or thousands of other kinds of channels, television channels, or from other kinds of experiences, viewing experiences. He also says at one point, which I think was really prescient, that we should be even careful of what he's saying, because he's providing interpretations. And one of the limitations of the form that he's working in, he says, is that television talks to you and you can't talk back to it. So it's not responsive, but of course that's not the case anymore, as evidenced by this video you're watching now, because here I am talking about television, talking back to television, if you like. So I think it's just fascinating stuff, and he was a fascinating bloke, really. Did a lot of other things apart from ways of seeing. There was an updated version called The Art of Looking, I think, a few years ago. He was involved in, and he did some novels and poetry and a whole host of things. But I kind of connected to him because, as I say, I think I kind of met him. It's about 25 years ago, this. It was in a bar in Manchester attached to a gallery called the Corner House, which I think is closed down now. And I was in this bar because it was just around the corner from Oxford Road railway station. I was about an hour before the train I was due to catch, so I went down to the Corner House and sat in the bar and had a beer. And it was quite full, and I was sitting at a table, and this bloke came up and asked if he could sit at my table, and he did, and he was quite drunk and very voluble and expressive, and started talking. Immediately he sat down and introduced himself as John Berger, and I thought, oh yeah, it probably is John Berger, he looks like him. And he was talking about his work and asking what I was doing, and was very engaged and engaging, involving other people around us in conversations. He was also talking very personally about himself and his life, about various tragedies in his life. I think he said at one point that his wife had died, or his lover or somebody had died recently, and how upset he was from that. And at one point he started crying about it, which got a lot of attention in this crowded bar in the Corner House. So we talked about that for a bit, and then he talked about the songs of Leonard Cohen. Now, one of the lines from the song Famous Blue Raincoat, I think it's called, something like that. And one of the lines in that was inspired by this person, John Berger's wife or lover, whoever it was. About this is something that they had said, and Leonard Cohen had been there, and Leonard Cohen had incorporated it into his song. Famous Blue Raincoat was torn at the shoulder. Anyway, we had quite a nice time, and I missed that train, and I got quite drunk as well. And then we went to another bar just round the corner from there, under the arches, as I say, next to Oxford Road railway station. Got really drunk, and I ended up not going home that night. Actually, I stayed with a friend in Manchester instead. So that was quite interesting. About a year later, actually, I was working in Sheffield, and I was talking to a bloke there, a photographer who knew in Sheffield, and I was telling him this story. He said, oh, I think I might have met him. And he described this interaction. It was stunningly similar to the one I'd had. And he said, yeah, he was telling me these stories about that as well. And this chap, this photographer in Sheffield, who knew a bit more about John Berger's output than I did, said that he talked to this person about, various books of John Berger's he'd read, and he'd said he got the impression that this person wasn't really John Berger at all. He knew quite a lot about John Berger, both in terms of his life and his writing and his ideas, but didn't seem to know everything correctly, or at least everything as it was documented. And my friend in Sheffield said that he suspected it wasn't John Berger at all. It was just some guy who liked hanging out in bars, pretending to be John Berger to impress gullible people like myself. So I don't know to this day whether that really was John Berger or not, or whether it was just somebody kind of cosplaying John Berger for, I don't know, self-esteem reasons or something, or to try and catch drinks off anybody, I suppose. Although I didn't actually catch any drinks on me that night. So I don't know whether that was John Berger or not. He was a bit of a pain in the arse towards the end of the night, actually, this chap. He got, as I say, he got really drunk, and I was drunk too. And he got really kind of leery with some women around the place. Didn't actually grow up them, but he came quite close at one point. And I think it was about that time when I made my excuses and left. So I'll never know. But anyway, yeah, John Berger, if you get the opportunity to have a look at his videos, which are all on YouTube, as I say, it's worth a look, even though they're dated, and even though he is wearing some appalling shirts of an appropriate 1970s vintage. Yeah, ways of seeing.